for the comment section. So I was live very recently on Periscope, but as Periscope is closing on the 31st of March, I have switched over to broadcasting on HAPS, which means I have this green screen. Look, at least it's honest. I'm not projecting a fabricated background that I was quite fond of that featured a grand piano and a fireplace that I just don't have. I live in a more tropical climate, no fireplace required. Yes, it's always summer. It's always summer where I live at the moment, which has many advantages and also a little bit of disadvantage. You don't get as many colds. All right, I am here to talk about the string of women killed today, and some men, at 3 different massage spas owned and operated by Asian families and with Asian employees, and so have been the target of violence from a 21-year-old man, Aaron Long, who professed a passion for guns and God, and he was in custody after a string of shootings that left 8 people dead so far. So let's see. Oh, August Phil says hello from Denver. Molly says you don't see green. It's a brown color to you. Oh, that's interesting. Ew, brown. Marsha says hi. And Sheldon's there, said hi and gave an award, a high award as well. Thank you, Sheldon, for that award. So I'm just looking at a Daily Beast article on the shooting. So I'm happy that Aaron Long of Georgia was taken into custody following a police chase. And the police aren't willing to say yet that it's a likely hate crime, but others have noted that this comes in a wave of targeted violence against the Asian American community. Now, Trump isn't in power, but you know what is happening at the moment? Joe Biden, President Biden, and Kamala Harris are really highlighting the power of effective government action. They're really making things happen in the United States to show what it's like to have leaders who have an interest and feel responsible for acting in a way to take care of the American people, to mitigate harm, to contain risk, and to spread vaccinations as quickly as possible in order to save as many lives as possible. So the very efficacy of the Biden administration is inflaming the most loyal of Trump supporters, who I presume are being aggravated by conversation on any social media channels that still permit conversation about Trump, to stand up for Trump's perspective on this, which is that he didn't abrogate his duty as president, that he didn't misdirect vaccination supplies, or that he didn't have such an inadequate vaccination distribution plan, that it just involved dropping off various vaccines at different airports in different states in order to leave it up to states to distribute, even though there wasn't any significant amount of federal funding allocated to helping states with that new task of distributing the vaccines to as many people as possible. Molly wants to know if Georgia has hate crime laws. That's a good question. Kimchi says hi. Kimchi says it appears green to you. Maybe we're discovering, does it appear to green to everybody else? Maybe we're discovering that Molly might have a degree of color blindness, which is not necessarily the case. I'm just speculating. Kim says hello from Washington. And Marsha says we must enact gun reform and stop these hate shootings. Gun reform would be great, to have a register of all gun owners, to have background checks conducted via a nationalized registry so that people didn't fall through gaps in the system. And every step that's taken to regulate gun ownership and gun usage is key, because human beings have this phenomenon, which is their behavior improves when they can see some reminders that they are being watched, that their behavior is being observed, that they're not operating in secret. So first-year psychology students will have heard evidence from research about those charity boxes where you can take lollies and you're supposed to leave coins, but there's no physical person there policing that system of exchange. And psychologists have determined that the rate of payment, or the number of people who actually put in money before they take out a lolly, increases when there are pictures of eyes put on the box. So if your brain can just see a representation of eyes, it makes you statistically more likely to comply with the requirement of paying for a lolly that you take. It reduces theft, as does a mirror. If you can see a glimpse of your own face, if you stick a little reflective mirror surface on a charity box, again, theft is reduced, because being able to observe yourself also contributes to self-awareness and evidently enhances moral reflection, and so compliance with any type of moral code. So anything that helps gun owners feel that they are being observed and monitored would reduce antisocial crimes by extrapolating from that logic. So you can't say that with any degree of definitiveness, but you can say it with enough confidence to say it's worth trying, that there's lots of reasons to believe that better policing, better regulation of gun ownership would result in fewer murders in the United States, because the US has a homicide rate that far outstrips that of other commensurately industrialized societies. People don't know this because people often speak at a public level about how America has high levels of gun violence. And what they're not necessarily always noting is that pro-gun people hear that and think, yes, but the gun violence is preventing all of the knife violence, or the existence of guns is preventing people from committing murder in other ways. And they don't realize that, no, America's sky-high rates of gun violence are actually just contributing to higher rates of violence overall. Yes. It's always important to look at what assumptions are being made by your political opponents, which is why it's key to think of them as political opponents and not just enemies, not to just dehumanize them by calling them vermin or termites or cockroaches, because that type of thinking is very much something that humans lean into when they're upset. It's understandable. When the angrier we are, the more punitive we get, the more our psyche kicks in to say, no more thinking and analysis. You need to be ready for violence to defend all that you hold dear, because the world around you is crumbling. But just think about how Trump supporters are always being manipulated to believe that the world around them is crumbling when it isn't. They're always being told that there are caravans of migrants taking their jobs, contributing to property theft. They're always being told that their societies are on the verge of collapse because of the actions of Democrats in weakening border controls, etc. They're always being fed this propaganda to these influence campaigns to make them ready, hypervigilant for action and for violence, rather than considered reflective engagement with evidence. Oh, there's some more comments that I haven't engaged with yet. Yes, Switzerland has a lot of guns, but something you're not noticing is in Switzerland, ammunition is highly regulated. So you might all have guns because Switzerland is using the population as a standing army on standby, but they don't have bullets, so they can't shoot themselves when they're upset or their psyche is out of whack and they feel depressed or angry or violent. When they're issued ammunition by their government because they need to go to war against a neighboring European country, then they would be able to use their weapons. But they are less able to use their weapons against themselves and against their communities and against their families. So when you cite Switzerland as a point of reference, it would behoove you to actually look into more of the dynamics of Switzerland other than your right-wing talking points, which lack validity. Inverse impact it hasn't really engaged with the point that I've just made. Metal detectors are in some schools, but not all, because it has a psychological impact on students when you make preparation for school shootings more visible. It has a negative psychological impact. And metal detectors, just like school security officers, are not that likely to contribute to student safety, in that, look what happened when there was an actual gun on the premise of the Parkland School, the Marjorie Stone Douglas School. The security officer hid outside the school and didn't want to have to go and confront a semi-automatic weapon, or didn't want to have to run into the path of semi-automatic weapon fire armed with his handgun. And even if he had a semi-automatic weapon on his own, he still might have hid outside, because a shooter would have the advantage of having adopted a position. And if you run in to confront them, you don't have the element of being established where you are and having established perhaps some cover. You are always on the back foot as someone running in trying to challenge someone who has a semi-automatic weapon and a very cultivated commitment to killing people. Sheldon says the Swiss prefer chocolate. Yes, well, the Swiss government tried to stay neutral in World War II, but it's been noted by a lot of historians that that neutrality did kind of work out in a helpful way for Nazis, in that Swiss banks allowed Nazis to make deposits of a lot of wealth and possessions that had been stolen from their victims. So a lot of paintings that had belonged to Jewish families, as well as money that had belonged to Jewish families, and other political opponents of the Nazis who had been murdered in the death camps. Marcia is saying we need mental health screening of all students, especially high school and college aged, or even just resources available for people who have difficulties. But yes, I agree, a lot of the most violent people in high schools or colleges wouldn't necessarily know that they have a problem with violence. It's almost as if you need a screener for someone who has access to weapons and a strong sense of entitlement and grievance. A lot of the people who turn out to be mass shooters often have preceding incidents of violence against their intimate family members. So they will have been violent to a female partner, or violent to their mother or father or other relative. So one important way to prevent crimes of mass murder is to have a better gradated response system to people who commit crimes of intimate partner violence. Yes, Marshall points out that the Swiss were complicit with the Nazis. Sheldon's speculating that a mental health exam could be hidden within the SAT exams. Inverse Impact is saying he remembers when he used to go to therapy, it helped a lot. And I'm assuming maleness, which is presumptuous of me, but I'm assuming it because you came into bat for guns. And some women achieve a great deal of notoriety for promoting gun usage and gun ownership, like Marjorie Three Names and Lauren Boebert. Bye, darling. Yeah. But they are the exception. Look, they can be a fairly large exception. I'm sure there's a lot of women in various states, in various pockets of Republican loyalty and conservative media penetration. Wherever you have strong access to influence campaigns that try and convince you that gun ownership is all that stands between you and a tyrannical government, then you would support gun ownership very powerfully, because you believe that that's the only path away from tyranny. And if your government ever becomes tyrannical, you'll stop it with you and your mates with guns. Now, the Trump government was consolidating power and becoming very tyrannical. And it wasn't any actions undertaken by citizens with guns that stopped it. It was mobilizing voters and all of the work done by casual social media journalists, as well as some people within the mainstream media who sought to hold the Trump administration to account, who sought to expose their various corrupt dealings and their various distortions of and violations of the Constitution. Without that knowledge, without that exposure of the truth about the coronavirus, people would not have understood how Trump's and his administration's response to COVID was patently inadequate and patently and irresponsibly exposing Americans to danger. And then you would have had an extension and a continuation of the minoritarian rule of Trumpism that's enabled by the white affirmative action bias built into the Constitution, whereby that power, that disproportionate power of senators, two senators from even small population states that historically have grown wealthy from slavery and who are therefore more likely to have voters in those states with a nostalgia for and an attachment to systems of profiteering from the impoverishment and disempowerment of Black Americans. Trump says, a commenter called Pierre Creighton says he has destroyed the truth. Absolutely, he has not destroyed the truth. He sought to destroy the truth. I would accept that as a valid comment. Influence campaigns seek to muddy the epistemological waters, create confusion around what is the truth. Is it even worthwhile seeking to learn the truth? But ultimately, he failed and lost the election. The untruths have a life of their own and continue to circulate and create violence through their continuing brainwashing of vulnerable populations. And when I say vulnerable, I mean vulnerable to believing lies, intellectually vulnerable populations. That's an important word. I will use that term again. Intellectually vulnerable populations. People who live in areas where everybody they know watches Fox, and it's a desert, an information desert. Okay, so Craig says much better. That's really good. So the connection on HAPS is better. I could have been using HAPS all this time. So interesting. So I'm glad that's cleared up. Do other people feel similarly? Oh, that's nice. Pierre says, listen to this woman. She knows what she's talking about. I do know quite a lot about what I'm talking about. I haven't been raised in a way that has immersed me in American history or American civics, but I've invested some time and energy in learning about it over the last few years. And my understanding is at least free from a lot of untruthful misconceptions that have managed to permeate the American education system in areas where, say, people in Texas decide what textbooks are purchased for schools. All right. Sheldon says there are a lot of nervous Republicans who have armed themselves for fear of the radical Biden administration, foolishly buying into the conspiracy theorists. Yes, they're afraid of communism and what that means. And I'm hoping some of that irrational, pre-violent rhetoric and pre-violent ideology will dissipate because the Biden administration is campaigning on help is here. They are trying to make sure everybody knows that the reason why they're getting stimulus checks, the reason why the economy is projected to significantly rebound is because they are directing taxpayer-funded stimulus payments to where they need to go to prevent more consumers from falling off the fiscal cliff of insolvency due to losing jobs, due to then potentially losing their homes, and then not being able to reestablish themselves easily as time passes and the risk of COVID dissipates. And of course, we have to worry now about the risk of COVID not dissipating because of the actions of 7 irresponsible Republican governors who have ended all of the distancing measures in order to sabotage America's collective efforts to contain the virus, in order to keep the virus going so that Biden can't be seen to succeed. I think people should be more open in saying what an evident likely motivation is for Republican governors who are killing their citizens by saying, we're ending the mask mandates, we're opening up all the businesses that have been closed. We're doing it 2 or 3 months before everybody can get vaccinated, which will encourage potent variants of the virus to spread, which will make it more difficult for the virus, for the vaccine to keep everybody safe. They are undermining the efficacy of the vaccine for everyone by what they are doing. We always have to remember we can't just laugh off Republican governors as hurting their own constituents. They are hurting the prospect of all Americans to be safe, to be able to return to normal. They are keeping your children out of school with their actions across the United States, not just in Texas or Florida, where Governor Abbott in Texas is saying no more restrictions. Governor DeSantis in Florida saying no more restrictions. They are sabotaging the Biden administration's fantastic response to COVID in order to minimize the contrastive gulf between Biden's actions and Trump's actions. Because they know if people can see so clearly how the virus and the threat of the virus resolves under competent leadership, that they will then be more motivated or be more able to clearly see Trump's inaction and Trump's sabotage for what it is. That's true. Pierre said he destroyed the truth for many Americans. He did. It was an extension of a process that's been ongoing for approximately 40 years since Ronald Reagan, whereby an alternate reality was cultivated in the minds of Republican voters who were taught to believe that a welfare state meant giving your hard-earned tax dollars to the undeserving, that there was a majority of welfare recipients who were trying to game the system, and that you should therefore oppose on principle any form of government payments, that was always robbing from the successful to give to the undeserving. That was a ideology that was spun by Reagan and sold to many, many American voters through Newt Gingrich, through conservative media, through Rush Limbaugh, through Sean Hannity, for literal decades of brain poisoning. The dog walker guy is saying hello, hello. Marsha has requested a song. I love you for that. Thank you, Marsha. I adore singing. And Marsha's saying this was late from the other night. Yes. Someone called Cybergrief is saying Trump echo-chambered an association between it being a China responsibility for the virus instead of wanting to be held accountable by the public, by a critical mass of the public, to hold him accountable for his inaction and outright sabotage of a leadership response to the pandemic. So anybody who did try and lead the American public out of danger, their efforts were constantly sabotaged and undermined by the Trump administration and his allies and associates in the Republican Party all across the United States. Molly points out that it may take years for some Trumpers to realize that they were used. Some may never return to reality. I would agree. I would say that Trump compounded a problem that predated Trump, which is that wealthy petrochemical oligarchs such as the Koch brothers, who wanted to be able to minimize their expenditure in terms of preventing pollution, and so didn't like regulation and the Environmental Protection Authority, have been seeking to undermine Americans' belief in workable government for a long time, for decades. And they have purchased the loyalty of various politicians. They have funded educational institutions. They have funded scholarships. They have informed the thinking of a lot of people who operate in elite circles. The Kochs, the Mercers, there's a lot of covert Christo-fascist American billionaire influence on American government. And then once they had enough conservative Supreme Court judges, they were able to pass Citizens United, which helped wealthy people then legally use their wealth to purchase far bigger megaphones than ordinary people could, to promote the election of competent, ethical officials, which creates more unethical incompetence and creates also too much pressure on ordinary people to try and keep paying more and more money for donating it to political causes in order to be able to compete in an arena in which billionaires can spend unlimited amounts of money purchasing advertisements. And that pressure creates a degree of learned helplessness in the population, who then switch off because it takes too much money and too much energy to push back against the corrupt workings of the Koch brothers, which also created a vulnerability in the population to someone like Bernie Sanders, who encourages the cult of personality to build around himself, because he positioned himself as one of the only people calling out the malign influence of various corporate power brokers, such as the Koch brothers. So he was telling people important truths and validating their emotions about being effectively punished for poverty, because the Koch brothers were helping buy ever more powerful megaphones to increase the vote for corrupt Republican politicians, who would then seek to cement the impoverishment of low-income Americans by voting against increases in the minimum wage, by voting against regulation of banks so that they couldn't punish people for having low amounts of money in their bank account. People get fined, people get fees for having small amounts of money. There are so many now baked in punishments that are legal ways to punish people for being poor, which is just another way of cementing a serf class in the United States. So America is still beset by the ills of a hierarchical system that imprisons people in poverty by virtue of making it more difficult to get an adequate education, by trying to raise the bar for education by making it more and more expensive, which has the effect of excluding a lot of people of color or burdening them with disproportionate debt because they don't have families who can use their pre-existing wealth to prepay for university tuition fees, or take out mortgages on the homes that they're more likely to own because they're white, and their relatives are more likely to have been able to take out bank loans and mortgages, whereas Black families are more likely to have lived in red line districts, which were excluded from government-backed home loan opportunities. And those red line policies were often then osmotically spread within banking institutions, so that nobody wanted to lend money to people who lived in those districts, whether or not it was government-backed mortgages or just any type of mortgages, so that this compounded the differences in wealth over time between white families and Black families. And this is what institutional racism refers to, just policies that no longer need somebody maliciously in charge of things making racist decisions. It just means the par for the course baked in racism that somebody initially organized, and then everybody else just keeps doing it because it's how things are done. it's become institutional and doesn't require one racist individual to be directing it anymore. You just don't lend people money if they live in these certain districts that somebody at some point put a red line around. Who knows why? Was it because lots of Black families live in that area? Who can say? We just still do it. It's our practice in our institution. We don't lend to people if they live in those districts. It's just, we don't. It doesn't happen. And then people say, look, slavery was from the past. We don't have slavery anymore. Therefore, you're addicted to past grievance culture if you dare insist that there are still powerful ongoing dynamics of discrimination. Robert's tuned in to say that Asian massage parlors in Atlanta, yes, have been shot at in Georgia in the United States. Yes, we have covered this. I've said that Trump delegated domestic terrorism acts to his followers. And in moments of duress, they respond. Christopher wants to know whether Democrats not aware that Republicans would introduce bills to suppress the vote. I think people might have anticipated that after the success of the Democratic Party in gaining 2 Senate seats in Georgia and turning Georgia blue, which was a surprise upset of people's expectations, I had my fingers crossed for that outcome, but I knew it was by no means guaranteed. I knew that Trump would struggle to endorse the Republican candidates because if Republicans were able to win in Georgia, that would undermine his narrative of, I couldn't win in Georgia because the voting machines are rigged in favor of the Democrats. So he wanted the Democrats to win in part in order to uphold his claim to have had the election results stolen from him and had the results of Georgia flipped through misconduct, through voting machine operative misconduct to the Democrats. So Trump was always going to be ambivalent about wanting Republican candidates to succeed in Georgia. So hooray, they won. But the response of Republicans has been to knuckle down with their primary strategy for winning elections, which is not to win over more people. It is to prevent people who are identifiably more likely to vote for Democrats, to prevent their access to the polling booth, to make it more difficult for them to vote, to discourage and deter voters. Those efforts have often backfired on Republicans when African Americans became aware of the voter suppressive measures, when there was publicity attracted to those steps. That has galvanized turnout. But we can't hope that galvanized response will continue now that Trump is out of office. We don't know that people will stay as aware of Republican misconduct. It might be really obvious to people that Republicans don't have their best interests at heart, that none of them could bring themselves to vote for a rescue package that over 70% of Americans support. So it's to be hoped that there will be still a galvanized voter turnout in defiance of all of these Republican measures to restrict the vote. What Democrats have done is put together a bill to make it a federal guarantee that people will have access to the vote, to make it that there's a federal guarantee to make it easier to vote. But that is being undermined by all of the passage of legislation at the state level in Republican-controlled legislatures, which are numerous. And what might happen is Democrats might not be able to pass their pro-voting bill, the H.R. 1 bill, because they can't just have a simple majority to pass it. They have to be able to defeat the filibuster with 60 votes. And no Republican will vote for the H.R. 1 bill because that will make it easier for Democratic voters to vote. And more people voting means the fact that Democrat voters are actually more numerous than Republican voters, that will triumph. Republican voters are more likely to live in areas where it's easier to vote, where the lines are fewer, and Republican-controlled state legislatures make it easier for Republican strongholds to have easy access voting for their voters, and then difficult to access voting in areas where they know are Democratic strongholds. We have in the comments a hello from Philadelphia. Hello. Inverse Impact complained that the mainstream media is liberal. It's a misconception promoted by Republicans who seek to gain the refs. Just at this point in history, reality leans to the left because the right are fixated on various untruths that conveniently... Oh, I don't know if... Hang on. I don't know if you can see me. Maybe you can. All right, let's have a look. So we are rejecting a speculation that the mainstream media is left. Reality is left, and nevertheless, Republicans work the refs to pressure the mainstream media to adopt more right-wing positions than would be fair. The mainstream media is pressured by Republicans to be unduly committed to a both sides false equivalency in which they say Republicans say this, Democrats say that, and they don't give adequate weighting to the fact that the Republican position is clearly fabricated and full of lies and manipulative untruths. So the rich are not all right-wing because some people have principles stronger than self-advancement at a financial sense. So yes, lots of wealthy, powerful people are Republicans because they want to minimize their tax burden. They view themselves as being entirely successful based on merit. They don't view that luck had any role in their success, and therefore they view the unfortunate not as suffering from any misfortune, but suffering from poor character, which therefore should not be rewarded with government help. And they are effectively Malthusian in their worldview. Robert Malthus being an English reverend who thought that helping poor people might be ill-advised because that would just encourage them to procreate, and then you would have more people to help. And there are many flaws with that very cruel intellectual approach to the world. It's an approach that underpins the creation of Thanos as a fictional character who wanted to save the world by reducing overpopulation and overconsumption of resources by snapping his fingers and eliminating half the population of the universe. Republicans are often like that in saying, well, if we just let a lot of people die, that's surely good, because then it won't affect me. I'm wealthy enough to stay alive. But if less of you poor people are alive, that's fine because you're not really worthy of life anyway. Or they're happy for there to be no government services because then it keeps people in an impoverished and disempowered state where they're more likely to accept whatever working conditions wealthy corporate owners want to create, therefore maximizing potential profits for wealthy people. Because if you have a semi-enslaved population, enslaved because they don't have the liberty to create extra opportunities for themselves, they don't have the time to go to community college at nighttime because they have to spend their life in 2 or 3 jobs to earn enough to live on, to cover their very basic living expenses, which also means people's family lives suffer. They can't help their children with homework or strengthen family bonds by sharing happy times together and creating fun, happy memories. Everybody's always rushing off to different jobs to just stay alive, to stay housed and fed. And that's a function of Republican opposition to minimum wages and to benefits such as SNAP benefits, and to allowing companies to flourish when they're still effectively being subsidized by the taxpayer because they pay very low wages and maximize the profits for the owner. But then in order for their employees not to starve to death, they have to depend on food stamps from the government, which means that the government taxpayer payments are enabling corporations to still keep their working population alive. And that means taxpayers are therefore effectively subsidizing the profits of these very powerful corporations such as McDonald's and Walmart, etc., because their workforce would be dead if it were not for taxpayers funding government programs to put food on the table of these underpaid workers. Oh, I'm glad from, oops, whoa. We had some vulgar comments from Twitter, and Haps managed to hide them. And I only saw them myself because I clicked unhide comment because I was curious. So good job, Haps, in having a filter that keeps out very obvious vulgarities from the platform. Thank you. If you keep the poor sick, sickness will spread. Yes. It's important to note that it benefits certain unprincipled Republicans, which appears to be many, because it maintains the stratification of American society into entrenched poverty, where people are vulnerable to accepting whatever conditions are imposed by their employers. Thank you. Everybody registered it as spam. So it wasn't an automatic filter. It was you guys. And Kim. Thank you, Kim, Craig, and Sheldon. Lovely, lovely. Good work, everybody. Well, I might try and go for a walk, get some exercise under my belt, stay healthy. Although, let's see if there's anything else we want to cover before we go, and then I'll do some incidental exercise while we do that. Mitch McConnell threatens to hold up Democratic legislative agenda if filibuster rules are changed. Interestingly enough, he fully intends to hold up the Democratic legislative agenda if the filibuster rules remain unchanged. So his escalation of threats highlights, I think, that he is afraid and understands that if Democrats are strong in their opposition to the filibuster, then he will lose more power. And the Republican Party will lose more power. And his donors, the Koch brothers, well, the alive Koch brother, will lose more power. So we've covered that Andrei Derkach is part of Team Giuliani. The Team Giuliani has someone called Alexander Onyshenko, Andrei Derkach, Russian-linked operatives, and Telizenko. We're learning their names because we're going to have a resurgence of exposure of Trump and his Russian backing in 2016 and 2020, because we were waiting for this story to have extra life given to it because the right-wing media machine was successful in disparaging anybody who talked about the very evident connection between Russia and the Trump campaign in 2016. We knew it was ongoing. We just got tired of talking about it because the weight of the pendulum seemed to be in their favor in terms of suppressing that and invalidating those known truths about the role of Russian operatives such as Konstantin Kilimnik helping liaise between Paul Manafort via Rick Gates, the Trump's deputy campaign manager, in order to help secure a thin electoral college victory for Trump in 2016. So this is me doing some exercise now, and we can talk about Trump and Russia as easily as ever, still while doing exercise. These are 1.5 kilo weights. I'll have to upgrade to 2 kilo weights. I can lift 2 kilo weights and still, off the top of my head, describe that Michael Cohen, Trump's personal attorney, was a key liaison between the Russian government and Trump, who wanted to build a tower in Moscow, that there was a Trump signature on a letter of intent with regards to building a tower in Moscow, and that books have been published highlighting the long-term cultivation of Trump as a Russian asset, not an agent, an asset, which means you don't necessarily know that you're being manipulated by Russian leaders to do their bidding, to undermine your own nation. All you understand is that you're advancing your own interest. And in Trump's case, his own interests lay with regards to his ambition to build a big F-off tower in Moscow that said Trump on it, that would have sky-high letters saying Trump. And he thought, yep, I'm definitely schmoozing Putin because I'm offering him the penthouse apartment. And Putin had no need to have a penthouse apartment in Trump Tower. He's the wealthiest man in the world in all probability. He probably has secret billions squirreled away in various secret offshore accounts. Some of the Panama Papers have exposed that Putin's childhood friends have inexplicable billions of dollars in bank accounts, despite being cello teachers. And Putin just was happy to string Trump along, thinking, yes, this enables me to manipulate a potential leader of the free world. And then he was able to manipulate the leader of the free world for 4 years in office and cause incredible amounts of damage to the American people, to American infrastructure, to create a whole potential 40% of the population that would be highly resistant to reality, to evidence, to truth, which is potentially going to undermine the efficacy of the vaccine, because you need to achieve herd immunity. Herd immunity is an outcome of vaccination. It's not a strategy to pursue with regards to a virus. Herd immunity is an outcome that you arrive at when a sufficiently substantial proportion of the population has been vaccinated. And you haven't allowed a disease to spread so broadly that multiple variations become prevalent, including variations which circumvent the action of the vaccine. So by Putin's actions in paying people to get on Facebook and infiltrate Facebook women's groups that are pro-health and to amplify that naturalistic fallacy that if something's created, then it's artificial and it's bad and you shouldn't engage with it, to convince a lot of women to adopt a position that vaccinations would be bad, that could potentially imperil their children's health and so should never be used. Putin has contributed to outbreaks of measles around the world in industrialized nations where measles should be eliminated by now. Putin has been a contributory factor of that. And there's documented evidence that Russian accounts have been in Facebook health groups and other social media groups devoted to natural health. Putin does have a castle, very true. Chris came along and said hi from Denver. Hello, Chris. Inverse also says it's not the 1980s. Why not just ally with Russia? Russia is a hostile adversarial nation that wants to undermine democracies around the world in order to better convince its own citizens that democracy is an untenable system of government. So that's one important reason for not allying with Russia. Their leaders want more Americans to die, and in order to keep more Russians in servitude and more Russians as victimized by government corruption without knowing that there's an alternative to campaign for. Sheldon constructs sandcastles. Craig asks, how has Trump got into so many people's heads? because it's not just Trump, it's powerful Republican billionaires who've spent years buying and maintaining propaganda networks like conservative radio. So that creates a emotional infrastructure that Trump then just could tap into and exacerbate a bit to achieve a critical mass of reality-averse people. Molly says, we bought a Victorian house that resembles a castle. It's hell to clean the windows. That's hilarious. Where is your Victorian house, Molly? In Pennsylvania. I'm coming to visit and I will help clean the windows if you invite me. If I make it to the US and the US makes it through this pandemic, and people in Republican states keep wearing masks and staying away from each other in indoor settings, even as their governors seek to undermine the Biden pandemic response. All right. Oh, have I finished doing exercise? Maybe I'll do a song before I go. Do we have any song requests? Oh, a very well-informed commentator from Twitter. She's a woman, Marcy something, and her Twitter handle is Empty Wheel. She points out that we're all getting too excited over the news that the Kavanaugh FBI investigation is being looked at, because people on the left all understood that the investigation of Kavanaugh before he was appointed to the Supreme Court was patently inadequate, that they didn't interview the woman from Yale who was a classmate of Kavanaugh's and said at a party he took out his penis and waved it in her face. They didn't interview her. They just did a very formulaic pre-Supreme Court check. They didn't go and investigate the allegations against Kavanaugh with any seriousness at all. The investigation took 2 days and they didn't interview key witnesses and key people who supported the accounts that Kavanaugh was a habitual alcoholic who had no qualms about exposing himself to women and asserting his sexuality in the face of opposition. And it looks like it's just going to be a request maybe that various Democratic lawmakers are going to make to the FBI, please explain yourself. And the FBI is just going to maybe write some letters about it and say, at the time it was felt that this level of investigation was appropriate. So not that they're going to reopen or redo the investigation into Kavanaugh, who is now cheerfully ensconced on the Supreme Court, where he and his other conservative colleagues are doing still massive damage to America by doing things like overturning state laws to prevent indoor mass gatherings such as church events, because they deem that to be discrimination against religious people and so a violation of the First Amendment, which is not true, because you can't scream fire in a theatre if you have a religion that celebrates screaming fire in a theatre. There is a limiting principle to the First Amendment, but those misguided, corrupted, conservative Supreme Court justices are happy for more Americans to die in order for them to promote a conservative agenda of asserting the primacy of religious rights over the rights of Americans to stay safe from endangerment, from people doing the viral equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theatre, which is to say attend church during a pandemic. Marsha says, I'm always invited to Long Island. Thank you, Marsha. I love knowing that when I move to the US, I might potentially have invitations to stay. Molly says I can stay in the tower. Oh, that sounds exciting and a little bit scary in an English sense. You go to the tower when you're going to be executed. Yes, Kavanaugh's debts. Very important point that Sheldon's just raised. Kavanaugh had a $1.2 million mortgage, was a what was he, a district court judge, so his salary was not that high. And he also paid $92,000 to join a country club, and also had, was it $132,000 debt on his credit card, which he claimed was for season tickets for some sporting season, and that his friends paid him back, presumably in cash, because it all was not explained and he was not asked adequate amounts of questions about that in the Senate. His finances are very contentious, and it would appear people paid off his debts for him. So yes, Molly points out that they need all of the judges to look into that. And that, yes, Hillary certainly withstood lots of investigations initiated by Republicans, and the reason why she didn't receive any criminal charges was because she was innocent of crimes. And you can see that because she was not convicted even during the Trump administration, where he definitely was trying to lean on people to attack his political opponents. Well, Kim's making a very important point. She says America needs babies. It's true, the birth rate has fallen significantly over the last few years in the United States. And conservatives want those babies to be white or reared white via adoption. Yes, which is a type of genocide, when you adopt people and then don't, and then criticize those people for their culture so that they resent or hate or feel bad about their background. If you do that on a broad scale, that falls within the remit of genocidal definitions. But just more generally speaking, is a very bad racist thing to do, to adopt a black child or a Hispanic child and then shame them over their whole life. And I've seen countless accounts of that happening to people who've said, yep, they were told, oh, we don't want you to turn out like your slut mother, and they were made to feel bad for their genetic racial background, which is shameful and atrocious. All right. Well, singing might come another time because we didn't have any specific song requests, and I will try not to impose myself on the ears of my beloved audience. Thank you so much for your time today. And I hope to see you again. Thank you for joining me, even though I know I haven't been very predictably on lately. I'll be back, and I'll try and aim for a little earlier, starting a little earlier so that I finish earlier. And if you have any more ideas for exercise, I'm still going to try and keep an element of working in some self-care, because we're still working to dissipate all the stress caused by existing or living through the years when there was an aspiring despot. There was an authoritarian demagogue in the Oval Office, ostensibly leading the free world. The public will learn more about how Putin was able to influence Trump to betray his responsibilities as a purported leader of the United States. There'll be more evidence perhaps coming out from doctors or researchers who were shackled by Trump and his benighted son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to sabotage vaccine distribution, to sabotage protective equipment distribution, etc. Chris loves the multitasking. Oh, you like my exercise? Thank you. I'm glad to be supported in this, because to me, it's been a struggle to keep up with self-care whilst suffering through all of the fascism-induced anxiety. So I'm pleased to be sort of on the flip side of the dominance of fascism in America, but there's still all of this residual fascism to worry about. And I'm determined to try and stay fit and strong, or to cultivate fitness and strongness as characteristics while I can. Molly's going to go bottle feed some bat pups who are squeaking Sheldon says, take care. Kimchi says, great show as always. Thank you. Venus Flytrap just subscribed. Thank you, Venus Flytrap. And Kushner has advice for Biden, Ari, the Middle East. Wow. Oh, and I've now been live for close to precisely 1 hour. So what a great time to end the broadcast. Thank you, everybody, and talk again soon. Stay safe. Namaste, which I've recently learned means the light in me honors the light in you. I'm not entirely comfortable with it yet, but I'll work on it. Namaste. No. Namaste. Bye, Christopher. Thank you. Sheldon, Molly, Kim, Chris, Cybergrief, Craig, Marsha, and anybody else? That's all. Shalom. Oh, shalom. I could do that. Shalom. Namaste. I'm Jewish. I'm allowed.